Lord Dannatt, thank you so much for your time. What message do you think Russia is trying to send with this record drone strike on Kyiv?
The message that is coming out of the Kremlin is, well, you might be talking about wanting to make peace in Ukraine, and Mr. Trump, you might be talking about it, and European leaders might be talking about it. But frankly, here in the Kremlin, we're not really interested. We will continue with what we've called our special military operation, and we believe we're succeeding. We've got no interest in peace at the present moment. I think that's the message that's coming out of the Kremlin, disappointingly, at the present time.
President Trump's threat of further sanctions. We've seen a lot of sanctions over the past few years. Is this able to realistically change Vladimir Putin's plans for Ukraine?
Well, I think this is the problem that Donald Trump has now got. I mean, he reached out 2 or 3 weeks ago and they had that summit. And the two leaders were pictured across the world of speaking together. But since then, we don't really see any signs of peace coming out of Russia. And Donald Trump has got now to find ways of putting more pressure on Russia. And there have always been more sanctions that could be applied. And I think Donald Trump has now got to decide, well, as much as he would like to try and show that he can do a deal with Vladimir Putin, he can get on well with Vladimir Putin, is what he would like to show. But he may have to reluctantly decide that actually, to use his own words, Putin is tapping him along, and that he may have to toughen up, put more sanctions, and support the Ukrainians even more, and support the Europeans in their planning for whatever might follow by way of a ceasefire. So I think Donald Trump is having to reluctantly realize that his overtures to Putin are being rejected. Every time they have a conversation, it seems that there's another major airstrike on Kyiv or other parts of Ukraine.
There's been a lot of talk as well of a peacekeeping force on the ground. Is this feasible in your mind?
Well, there's talk about all kinds of measures being considered after a ceasefire. And of course, that phrase, after a ceasefire, is absolutely material. There's no way that anything could be done by international forces on the ground ahead of a ceasefire. And begs the question, we were talking about it just now, do we see any prospects for a ceasefire? Well, at the present moment, I don't. However, what's going on in the meantime is a coalition of nations that are willing to participate in peace arrangements, getting on and planning together. The military is good at planning, and various contingency plans are being put together, which might be put into place after a ceasefire. But again, I come back to what I said just now. Nothing can happen until there is a ceasefire, and I can't see any circumstances at the present moment when Vladimir Putin will be willing to have a ceasefire, despite the fact that Trump is calling for one.
We saw Putin, along with Xi and Kim Jong-un, in China for the World War II anniversary. What did you make of their military parade?
Well, it was very impressive, and it was designed to be impressive. It was designed particularly to show non-aligned countries that there is an alternative to the West, the world, the West being led by America. What they were trying to show from Beijing was that a combination of China, Russia, and to an extent North Korea is an alternative to an American-led world. The military power on display was very impressive. But I think we mustn't discount the fact that this is another significant global bloc that is being put together, is being strengthened as China's economy is strengthening, as its military is being increased, that this is an alternative bloc of power to an American Trump-led West.
And as you stated, it was impressive. It drew a lot of praise online. Does this reinforce President Trump's idea that the West must up their military spending?
Well, of course, this is absolutely the case. Unless the West, under US leadership, wants to quietly accept second fiddle in the world, then we have to increase our defence spending, increase our defence capability. Not that we want to be better able to fight a war, but to show that we can talk from a position of strength to deter further incursions in Europe by Russia, further adventures by China in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, there's been a lot of focus on whether China might move against Taiwan. Well, this is always possible, and if China thinks that America is weak, that American security guarantees to Taiwan, to the Philippines, to South Korea, to Japan are not really to be taken seriously, then it increases the possibility of China deciding to move rapidly against Taiwan. So the West has to look seriously at its military capability, look at the amount of money that it's spending on it, and as most sensible commentators are saying and have been saying for some time, we need to increase our defence budgets to increase our defensive deterrent capability.
And as it stands at Lord Dannatt, would the West be able to defend Taiwan against a Chinese attack?
Well, that is an extraordinarily good question. There is no doubt that the Chinese military is very powerful. It's obviously much more significant than the Taiwanese military capability. It begs the question, the extent to which America would be prepared to put its military might at the behest of Taiwan and risk being involved in a very serious, effectively a war with China. Most sensible people, most rational people wouldn't want to see this. So this comes back to the whole question of deterrence and security guarantees, which is why it's really important the United States shows that it's strong in the Indo-Pacific area, is prepared to honor its security guarantees to Taiwan, to South Korea, to the Philippines, and to Japan, and to make the Chinese leadership think again. Now, there is a school of thought, which I understand, that if the Chinese are prepared to be patient, there is quite a proportion of the Taiwanese population that would probably prefer to be linked to mainland China and not for Taiwan to remain independent. So it could well be that if China is prepared to play a long game, Taiwan might at some point drop into its lap without having to fight for it. Now that's a matter for the Taiwanese people on a democratic basis, but it would be infinitely preferable for the status quo to remain, for America to show that it is strong enough to deter Chinese aggression, and for the Chinese to be sensible enough not to risk it.
And moving back to the question of military spending, what has been your impression of President Trump's methods in regards to cajoling, if you will, or harassing NATO members in order to increase their military spending?
Well, he's been effective as far as that's concerned, and most people would agree this is not unreasonable. For too long since the end of the Cold War, European countries have been prepared to shelter not just under the United States nuclear umbrella, but to a large extent under the United States conventional capability umbrella. And for nations a few years ago to be spending less than 2% of their GDP on defense, when America was spending much more, and part of that was for the security of Europe, it's not unreasonable that Trump has been cajoling, persuading, arguing the case that European countries should spend more. Now, at the last NATO summit, commitments were made that countries like the United Kingdom would move towards 3.5% of GDP to be spent on hard power, and up to 5% of GDP on defence and security related matters. Now, that's quite a significant increase for the United Kingdom from the somewhere between 2.3 and 2.5% of what we spend now, effectively doubling that. But Trump is not wrong to say, come on, you Europeans, you can't rely on the United States to look after your security. You've got to do it yourself. Your economies are large enough. You can afford to do this. Now get on and do it. And I think of the many things that he's done and said, that is the most sensible, unwelcome in many European countries, but he's right. And European countries have got to step up to the plate, find the cash, and increase defence capability to deter further aggression from Russia.
And I'd like to pick your brain on a question. Is it ever a size of quality over quality? I've seen an interview done by a UK Army, British Army captain, who spoke about you could fit the entirety of the British Army into Wembley Stadium. It holds about 90,000. How big was the Army when you first joined?
Well, the Army when I first joined in the late 60s was somewhere over 150,000, of which more than 50,000 were stationed in what was then West Germany as part of the West's deterrent force during the Cold War. Now, a lot changed when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989 and the Soviet Union disappeared. The Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union's armed forces crumbled, and many countries took successive peace dividends, and it's meant that the British Army has gone from when I joined over 150,000 now to somewhere around 75,000. Yes, it would fill Wembley Stadium with a few seats left over. Now those are judgments that politicians have made over the years, but there are now a realization that the world is not as secure as we would have wished it to be. There are threats to our security from China in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East. We've seen that from Iran through Hamas and Hezbollah being combated by Israel, and then in Europe from Russia. So there's a very strong case now that European countries should be increasing their defence expenditure in order to maintain their own security and deter further aggression.
And is it merely fantasy, the idea of conscription could ever rear its head in Europe again? We've seen the president of Latvia, he called for that over the summer. I'd like your take on that.
Well, countries in Europe have had a different tradition of conscription and national service. For most of the Cold War, many of the European countries continued to have conscription and a form of national service. Now, the United Kingdom doesn't have a tradition of national service. We had it for about 14 years between 1949 and 1963, apart from the days of the First and the Second World War. But if there is going to be a requirement for greater numbers in the armed forces of European countries, then governments have got to think about how they're going to find that manpower. Now, you can do it through market forces. You can put pay and conditions up to make it attractive for people to think they would like to have a career in the military. Or if that is not possible, or if that's not going to work, then some form of collective conscription on a quota basis may have to be considered. I think other countries other than the United Kingdom might go down that track sooner. Probably those countries that have a close border, like the Baltic states and Poland, with Russia. It's something the British government will have to consider, but I don't see a decision for conscription and national service in the United Kingdom coming anytime soon.
And how about national service? We're seeing a huge shortfall in the amount of people even available, even not for armed forces, to work in hospitals as porters. There's also a lot that I imagine, and you'll attest to, that you can learn in the army, regimen, discipline, etc. What are your thoughts on return of national service?
Well, if I've been asked that question once in the last 25 years, I've probably been asked it dozens of times. There is no doubt, if you talk to the former national service generation, that they will say that those days were amongst the best days of their life. They learnt how to live with other people. They travelled to interesting places. They knew how to respect discipline. They knew how to work properly. And that was a good contribution to the national workforce. But, you know, it's not the business of the armed forces to educate the national population. This is something for the Department of Education to do. It's something for commercial companies to do. So as much as people might like the benefits that came from national service, I think we're quite a long way from that. And anyway, the infrastructure required of having training depots and training camps up and down the country, that just doesn't exist anymore. Those bases have been closed during the 30-odd years of peace since the end of the Cold War. So it's one thing to talk about it, quite another thing to do it, quite another thing to afford it. And I think that if there was to be any form of return to national service, because we need more soldiers, sailors, airmen and Marines, it would be on a selective quota basis. But I think, as I said just now, in the United Kingdom, I think we're some way away from that still.
Just lastly, Lord Dannatt, we're going to turn to domestic matters within the UK. There's been a lot of talk of the Home Office that they would like to make use of the UK's, as you said, the lesser used army bases to house asylum seekers. What's your take on this? Well,
we've done that in the past, but it's related to what I was saying just now in the context of national service. There is not a large number of surplus and empty military bases up and down the country. As we've reduced the size of our armed forces, we've reduced the size of the defence estate. We've sold off housing and barracks and to an extent, training areas. So there is some capacity, but there's not a huge amount of capacity. I think the government is going to have to be more imaginative, possibly buying up land, erecting temporary accommodation. There aren't a large number of empty barracks just sitting there waiting to be filled up by migrants. When we reduced from 50,000 troops in Germany to 0, those barracks all became available to the German government, and we didn't have the equivalent number of spare barracks in the United Kingdom.
We're just out of time. Lord Dannatt, thanks so much for your time.